Before the afternoon barge arrived at the pier, the port city Runa had gone about its business as usual. The dormer shutters were clapped open, and the dry laundry strung between the houses was traded with freshly washed linens. The awning over the shop windows were drawn up to display the wares peddled by the merchants within. Up and down the cobblestone streets, lined with their provincial houses whose roofs were shingled with blue tiles, men and women haggled over their wares, their chores, and their complaints. Their incessant noise filled the streets from the pier to the plaza with its central fountain and decorated gables. Amidst the noise was the rumor Shem had sent home with those whom had attended his tale at the abalone plate the night before. The afternoon barge, however, brought ashore a sudden, virulent strain of discontent. A tide of laborers, home early from their shifts, flooded the city. Substantiations of the princess's absence riled the citizens of Runa into a contagious state of sociopathy and sadism. Sociopathic because the royal title blinded them from sympathizing with a mother who had just lost her daughter. Sadistic because they demanded others suffer, as they did, from doubts and anxiety. They posed questions to one another, the same questions Shem had posed on the ferry from Kaldar to Runa. Who would make the rules tomorrow? What would they lose? Did they even have anything to lose? What difference had they made, and what differences would they make? Where once the fear of those questions silenced and excluded the inquirers from the community, invitations were now extended to anyone with an answer. For so long they had been convinced that thought was for their leisure, and sought it only as a hobby. With authority now being based on proposals, they all wanted to be the first and loudest with the most appealing idea. Shem stood on a high tier of the fountain that dominated the plaza, perching it as a podium from which to pour his ideas. He could throw nuts or throw stitches, but he chose instead to throw ideas at the crowd. They frenzied to snatch any scrap of an opinion that might reaffirm their identity. Others attempted to scale after and take over his post, suddenly certain they either had the most to gain or the most to lose from these turning events. The sudden influx of ideas welled up and boiled over. Contrasting opinions heated the debate until it bubbled and spat, sparking actions that developed into regrets. Merchants made wealthy by the wares they peddled to the witches selfishly sided with the mayor, who was only trying to dutifully attend her task of negotiating for human gains from witches' ambitions. She was convinced the unfortunate matter warranted nothing more than calm conversations and cooperation, but her rhetoric could not dissuade her riled constituents. They were convinced that they did not have to wait for a witch's offer, but should institute a new order. They excluded the mayor from the negotiations and begged her abdication. Before the sun surrendered the day, the mayor had abandoned her seat on the balcony overlooking the growing crowd, incapable of defending the city from establishing some kind of independence. Freedom, however, cost the city its safety. As the citizens reclaimed the authority they had previously invested in the mayor's office, the value of cooperation fell in favor of setting expectations. Inexperienced with opinions of that caliber, communication failed, and the misunderstandings were clarified with physical altercations. Hollers haunted the night. For the innocent or recanting individuals who cowered in the darkened corners, it was the misery of regret which they heard howling through the night. Screams came from those whose opinion had been beaten out of them. Cries came from those whose opinions had prevailed. As soon as one disagreement was resolved, its victor turned to settle the next debate. Resolutions were stacked like tournament brackets, with a final round to be decided by whomever could best articulate with a clenched fist or kicked foot. Opinions and ideas had survived only a few hours, and those of the opinion they were most qualified had fallen with their investment in the fad. Shem, however, was not among them. Amid the humans, Shem remained one of the most versatile. He could negotiate in this ruckus just as easily as he could in the quiet of a tavern. He had the training, and turned his skill against fellow men and women, supplanting their opinions with his fist in their face. He had started this debacle, but intended to finish it as well. His victory would crown his authority in this new order. The screams that haunted the night, however, disguised his incoming usurpation. He held a pitchfork in one hand. It was the closest substitute to a javelin that had yet been raided. Several of his men, stirred by their fraternal allegiance and confident that they would gain from Shem's promotion, maintained their practice formations to defend their sergeant in his position, both intellectual and physical. They carried rakes and scythes, or held defensively before them planks of wood. Their makeshift weapons did nothing to defend them from the screams in the night, however. Early in the scuffles, the screams had distracted them from the fight. They practiced ignoring the sound until their sympathy for the fallen had been whittled away. Now immune to the cries, they were not distracted by the predator howls calling on them. Figures swept over the roofs and around the gables. They tucked their wings tightly against their ribs to slip out of their flight and into crashing trajectories. People snatched from the crowd were pinned by an impact that cracked and cratered the cobblestone below. No amount of wrestling pried free the limbs trapped beneath the megalithic weight and raking stone talons. Shem barely ducked beneath one sweeping figure, only to watch it take down a friend standing too close beside him. He turned to drive the pitchfork between its wings and into its spine, but the iron tongs glanced off, reverberating from the shock and stirring into Shem a quaking fear. With one hand still clamped on the soldier's throat, the monster turned on Shem. It flailed a wing to whip the rake out of Shem's hands. Shem fell back a step, but braced himself enough to stare into its eyes, which it pinched to better focus on him. Lithic lips lifted with a leer to display stalactite teeth. Its whole body was coarse with a sedimentary complexion. Its features were carved confusingly, both human and animal. Shem had heard it could be done, but had never before seen the gargoyles be released. He was no longer confused by the deflection of his pitchfork off its stone spine. As statues, they perched still on corbels and eaves of the castle, stuck staring and sneering at any who entered. In an attack, it was said that they could swirl and swarm as an added defense. These, however, had been sent to stalk a victim in the night, and they seemed satisfied with having hunted him. Shem tried to turn to run, but his shoulders were latched by the stone claws of a swooping gargoyle, and the floor was snatched from beneath his feet. The buildings beside him sank as the horizon lifted with his perspective. Windowsills swept past, then the eaves. Then he watched the blue shingle slip far away until the roofs were just cobbled patches that lined the aisles and alleys of Runa. Distance made everything miniature. The city was rendered into a model, toy-like, and the assault on his friends grew minuscule, disregarded as play. Everything sank away until from his ascending perspective he saw only a map of the city and coast. Silver moonlight dappled the treetops and glinted off the water. From this height the waves seemed to be frozen, lending to the sea an illusion that it was carved from black marble. He was southbound, undoubtedly being brought to Castle Osmara. The fortress was almost invisible in the night. The light of fireplaces and lamps was barely visible through the distant windows, and camouflaged the towers against the star-speckled sky. The walls, however, were a shade darker than the nocturnal backdrop, and this provided Shem a silhouette by which he could measure the speed of their approach. He was certain they were going to crash, and his fear would have choked him had the speed not already dragged the breath from his lungs. He could hear the waves below scratching against his speed. He ran backward against the fast approach, but each panic step only reminded him how he dangled, with no traction on the ground or on his fate. The castle was larger than he initially realized, however, and the distance greater than expected. The trip grew long, and Shem found the time to anticipate his fate and consider his pain. The gargoyle's claws tightly latched his arms, and a sharp prodding through his entire torso made him wonder whether his collarbone had been snapped. He lacked the strength to wrestle free, and even as a younger man may never have had it. Even if he could break the gargoyle's clutch, he figured from this height the choppy water below was as firm as the marble it mocked, and the fall would kill him instantly. He stopped kicking, and began the slow process of surrendering to his fate. Suddenly some ambitions grew painfully distant, utterly impossible. He had no children to forsake, no wife to whom he could come home, and there was only a loneliness to sacrifice for some higher cause. It made him feel his life was petty, and with fearful tears he mourned his uncertain and vain fate. With a vertigo swell, the gargoyle dropped out of the sky, and Shem felt himself choke on his stomach. The sacrificed elevation earned the gargoyle velocity, which, with a sudden spread of its lithic mantle, it used to drag them up to new heights. The mix of gravity's tightening pull and the atmosphere tearing around him convinced Shem that he was being rent in two by the sudden ascent. When they reached their apex, however, Shem's halves collected, and he was delivered whole to the temple tower's observation deck. It was a hard drop to the balcony that wrapped around the tower. The flap of the gargoyle's wings, as it settled on the balustrade, beat gusts over Shem's body. He struggled to push himself up against the blasts. Although bruised, his collarbone seemed intact. He looked up and found an arcade separating him from a brightly lit room filled with people clearly patient for his arrival. They all stood or sat very still. The first to move caught his eye. His general collapsed back from a crystal mounted on an elaborately carved pedestal. As the general's hands relinquished the crystal, the gargoyle relinquished its animation, left as a grotesque statue fixed to the balcony's balustrade. Clearly there had been some connection between these two talismans by which his general had identified him in the crowd. The next to move was Her Majesty, rising out of her chair with its high, elaborately carved back. He had seen her before, in passing. She had always looked old to him, but never frazzled like she did now. There was a purse in her lips and a scowl in her eyes which pinned him to that spot. Those congregated receded as she stood, as though a tide had washed her up and abandoned her on his same lonely shore. "This is him," she nipped each word. The general of the Order of Diadra pulled himself off of the floor, crutching himself with his hands on his knees. He sighed several deep breaths, clearly exhausted from the ordeal with the crystal. Mistaking the queen's statement for a question, he answered, "Yes, that is him." "Come here," she rasped, keeping her gaze locked on Shem. He stared back at her for a long time. He did not want to move, and met her stubborn gaze with his own. Osmara cocked her head, intrigued by and curious about his defiance. She turned momentarily to her generals to privately dismiss his gesture with a scoff, then turned back to Shem with ferocious indignation. "Come here," she bellowed in a key far deeper than her range would normally have allowed. He paid her command no more attention than he would an invitation. It was an opportunity, and, by the new order he sought to establish, it was his right whether or not to accept it. He considered the option. His arms hurt. He was not yet ready for a fight. He sat up and let his hands hang limp across his spread knees. "Not just yet, thank you," he grinned. "You villainous coward," Osmar drew each syllable notably long. "Dare to hide behind your hypocrisy, dare to ignore my desire, but presume I would entertain yours?" "Well, if it is any consolation, just because black magic does not let me warp the world to my will does not mean I am any less hurt by disappointment." A smile cracked Osmar's composure, and through it leaked a long, restrained, mocking laugh. "You presume to compare your will to mine? You want to match my burdens, own my responsibilities? I am cursed, wretched. I suffer so that you may thrive." "Pardon, Your Highness, but I will save my pity for someone who deserves it." Osmara bristled at his blatant contempt, but nobly chose to ignore its offense. "We shall speak frankly, then." She said it almost more as an order than an observation. "Shem," she spoke with such directness that no one else in the room seemed present at all, "come here. I wish to speak with you." "That is not very polite. If we are to speak as equals, Sergeant, then know that we use formalities only when talking with those of a lower class. They are not wasted on peers, and you are sadly misinformed if you expect me to make a compliment out of a basic request. And if I refuse, then take your barbarous lies elsewhere. I have better ways to waste my evenings. It is not a lie. If you have something to say, then come here and say it," Osmara charged.